Podcast cast podcast cast podcast.
Wow.
Hello everyone. Welcome to Cast Pod. Carter Explains Football. Actually, Calum, I don't think you would get that reference because I don't really use that song anymore.
Is that ESPN?
Yes. I guess I still use it for Monday Night Football. Here's the thing about the NFL that I feel like I didn't explain very well last time. It has some banger music. Between all the different networks having their own jingles and the NFL studios themselves, who are basically like, the NFL has its own studio that's job is to like keep track of the history, keep track of records, keep track of footage. They also make music. And it is bangers on the track, or bananas on the track, as they say.
That makes me think of a quick segue. It makes me think of this TikTok I saw of somebody watching the thing with Damar Hamlin, like live. And like it just like cut like right after he got like hit to a commercial, and it goes to the Burger King Whopper song.
Yes.
The obnoxious Whopper song, like right after you see this guy possibly die. And
yes.
Quite the banger, yes. I must say.
That has become... This NFL season has given us a lot of interesting stuff. A lot of fun stories to talk about. But I think the rise of the Whopper meme might be my favorite thing they've ever done. One of my favorite football podcasts, the Ringer Fantasy Show, just invited the two guys who wrote that jingle on to talk about it. Apparently, they also did Liberty. Oh
my God, not the Liberty Bibberty guys.
Yes, it is them. They're back, and they're out for vengeance. So I guess to start this episode, I wanted to ask, how much football would you say you consumed? I do think you were more active in the fantasy chat than last year, but other than looking at your roster for fantasy, did you absorb anything?
I can confidently say that one time I took glances at a TV that had football on it because one of my players was on it while I was at a restaurant.
I will accept that. Do you want to tell the audience how your fantasy team did? I got pretty despondent near the end when my team was falling apart, so I didn't actually keep track of the rankings very well.
Yeah, so it did really well in the beginning. I was mine and Jason's team went like 4-0 in the beginning, and so we were tied with first with you for a little while. Mm-hmm. And then it started to fall off a bit, and then we would win games near the end, but we ended up like fairly even, and I think overall we ended in 5th or 6th place. I think might have been 5th. So it was unfortunate, but didn't do too bad. I had some very good players on my team. Like there was a point where I was looking like at the stats, and I had like number 1 quarterback, number 1 running back, number 1 like tight end, and it was just like, oh, how'd that happen?
Yeah, Jason knows how to pick them and then forgets we exist for long periods of time.
True.
So for this episode, I just want to go through some of the big stories. I don't want to bore you by going through every team's like record this time around. I don't want to, because for me, I guess my pitch for this show is that the NFL is less about the game and more about the stories, more about the arcs these individual players and these franchises and this league as a whole takes. Like I like someone described it really well when they were justifying who they voted for some of the awards to end the year, where they're like, ultimately it came down for me, can I tell the story of this? If I were to write a book about this season, can I write it without this player, and this player? And I think that's just a good way of selling people on football as a whole, where it's like a really cool story that has a lot of moving parts and a lot of different characters and a lot of wacky shenanigans that happen.
That is a pretty interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, so I kind of broke it down into sort of like the 5 really, really big arcs, like the 4 or 5 really big arcs that kind of defined this season, like the big stories that even if you're casually watching, you would pick up on during the year. So, number one is parody was back, and everyone kind of didn't like it. This season was very interesting in that almost every team was at least a little bit competitive. Like, I'm trying to think of how to explain this, but the past couple of years, it has been very feast and famine for a lot of teams. Like there was like an elite of the elite, and then just a bunch of dumpster fires. And specifically, there was a lot of offense. Scoring was higher than it's ever been. You know, offense rules, and the teams that have the best offenses have insane records. But this year, everything kind of came back down to earth a little bit. And I would just describe it as it feels like the meta of the NFL has kind of changed. The past decade or so has been all about speed and spacing out the field. Basically, every team has had an approach of, let's get the best quarterback we can find and then give him like 4 or 5 really, really fast athletic guys and just stretch everything out. And it seems like finally defenses have caught up. And the result was there weren't a lot of games that were really blowouts this year. A lot of games were actually kind of, as I would describe, mud fights, where it's like really close scores, teams really grinding for points, really like battling just to get the upper hand. And it resulted in even a lot of the bad teams were at least close. Like there weren't any teams officially eliminated from playoff contention until December, which was pretty abnormal for the NFL. Usually, like early November is when we start having teams where it's like there is literally no amount of winning you can do to get yourself into the playoffs. Like the numbers just don't add up anymore compared to other teams.
You know who would be good for speed?
Who?
Lightning McQueen.
Oh, cow.
Yeah.
Do they have any other sports in that universe other than race cars? Well, there's the monster trucks.
The monster trucks, yeah. I don't think so. I feel like the Italian cars must have made a reference to soccer or something similar.
Well, that's Rocket League.
That's right. They must have Rocket League.
Oh God. They're going to make another freaking Cars movie. No. It's not like, and I guess what I mean is, like, even teams that were kind of bad were at least competitive. Like, one of the best examples is the Las Vegas Raiders were kind of a crap team this year. They were kind of at each other's throats all year. And yet, they only lost 2 games by more than a touchdown. The Chicago Bears were the worst team in the league. They only had 3 wins. And yet, they made the Bills and the Eagles sweat for it, who were like 2 of the top teams. And they were actually kind of fun to watch because, like, they had Justin Fields, who is a, electrifying player who is at least keeping them in games. There was a point where multiple divisions, every single team could have made the playoffs. Like the AFC East, there was a chance the Bills, Miami Dolphins, New England Patriots, and New York Jets would all get in. For the NFC East, the Eagles, Cowboys, Giants, and Commanders all looked like they were going to get in. It was an insanely close season, all things considered. And I would really say there was only in terms of dumpster fire teams, there was really only there was only 3 or 4. And I'd say that was more because of their stories as opposed to how they were actually playing, like how it happened as opposed to what happened.
Who are the worst ones then?
You know what? We will bump that up in the order because that'll be a fun discussion to have. So, sort of the disaster teams this year were the Arizona Cardinals, the Denver Broncos, who I have a whole separate section for, don't worry, and the Indianapolis Colts, which is funny because they weren't even the worst team in their division. The Texans had 1 more win than them, or 1 less win than them, but a lot of, if a team's a disaster or not is perception. And the Houston Texans, there was an understanding of look, they just simply don't have enough talent this year. They're probably going to have one of the worst records in the league, but that's okay because then they'll draft a quarterback and they'll start rebuilding with all the money and draft picks they have. The Indianapolis Colts, however, they expected to be good this year. They have been, and I talked a little bit about this last episode, In the early 2010s, they drafted Andrew Luck, who was like this once-in-a-generation quarterback. He was huge. He had a huge arm. He was super athletic. He was basically everything you want from a quarterback. And then he retired after like 8 years because he had too many injuries. It was like an out of the blue, nowhere. Like people thought it was like a joke or like someone's account had been hacked when he announced his retirement. And since then, the Colts have desperately been. It's kind of the Homer Simpson meme of the pig falling into the lake and being like, "It's still good. It's just slimy." They keep telling themselves like, "No, this team would have won a Super Bowl with him. If we just find another quarterback, we can make this work." And this is when the bottom finally fell out. They were 4-12-1. Yes, they had a tie, which basically ties happen. They only do one round of overtime in the regular season, and then they call it a tie just because the game is too physically demanding to do much more than that without getting people hurt. But they fired their coach. Well, first, they forced the coach to start a quarterback who was a rookie who had never played an NFL game before. And then after that, obviously didn't work. They fired him and replaced him with Jeff Saturday. Jeff Saturday was a former Colts player who was working at ESPN as a commentator, who has never coached in the NFL before. And you can guess how that went. Perhaps their best moment this year was they had a 34-point lead over the Minnesota Vikings and somehow lost. They gave up. That was the biggest, literally the biggest comeback in NFL history points-wise. No one has ever come back from that many points before.
That's insane.
Yes, it was actually kind of magnificent to watch. And then the only other real disaster, even looking at all these teams, I'm like, they weren't that bad this year. They had their ups and downs. Like I said, the Chicago Bears had the worst record in the league, but like they also are a super young team with a lot of scrappy, exciting players. And it's like, well, they'll figure it out. Like their season was a success on the grounds of, one, they know their quarterback, Justin Fields, is actually super exciting, super charming, and he's a good leader. It's like, okay, we drafted the right guy. He's not going to drown out there. So we just need to build around him. Like, so I would say their season was relatively successful. The other two I would say are the Los Angeles Rams and the Arizona Cardinals. The Los Angeles Rams more just because they won the Super Bowl last year and only won 5 out of 17 games this year. Yeah, the bottom kind of fell out, but even then, it's like, well, you sold out to win a Super Bowl, and now the bill came due. It came due way faster than anyone thought, but, you know, that happens sometimes. Like,
did they just like lose a bunch of their good people, or like?
So basically, they won the Super Bowl by creating a system known as Stars and Scrubs. So they traded away a lot of their draft picks and spent a lot of money to basically get 4 or 5 of the best guys at their position, or in the top 5. So on defense, they had Aaron Donald, who is the best defensive lineman. In their defensive backfield, they have Jalen Ramsey, who is like top 5 in his field. They had Cooper Kupp, who is a top 5 receiver, and Matthew Stafford, who's a top 5 quarterback. The problem is, if they get hurt or they miss games, sort of the entire bottom falls out, and you realize, like, oh, they have no one behind them who's particularly good. And combined with people retiring after winning the Super Bowl and just general malaise, like the whole thing kind of fell out from the bottom end. The Cardinals are the funnier one because I think you know about their whole drama where they decided to sign their sort of complicated quarterback, one of the most exciting players to play football who you don't trust to actually win games. He's like Kyler Murray. He's super athletic. He's super cool. He runs around like crazy, but he might not be good at winning. And like when he loses, and I feel bad because he was the most football player in Texas history. He did not lose a game in high school. I think he only lost 1 game in college, and now he's on a crappy pro team and just seems very tilted.
That's crazy.
And famously, they put a stipulation in his contract that said, oh, you have to study film for 8 hours a week. You can't be playing video games while you do it. It literally basically said you can't be playing video games while you're watching film of the other team. You know, you're doing like
to get a film degree while being a professional sports baller. That's crazy.
Yes. Yeah. So, and 8 is somehow the most embarrassing like number for like, because quarterbacks have to watch a lot of film of the other team to know what kind of defenses they run. So when you step out there as the quarterback, you can look over and be like, oh, they're running this defense. So that means I'm going to have to throw it here, or I'm going to have to change this play because it'll run right into the defense. 8 is somehow the saddest number because it's like, okay, if he was on, if it was like lower, if it was like 4, it would be like, oh my god, is this guy an idiot? Like, does he just not? Wait, like, what are we doing here? Or if it was like 30 hours, it's like, well, that's ridiculous. The only guy who did that was Peyton Manning. 8 is like the perfect middle ground of like, God, is this guy lazy or is he a child?
Dang, I never. This is probably why I'm not a professional athlete, but I never understood the watching the tape of the other team in preparation for a game. I always thought it was the most boring thing, and I didn't retain anything. Like, they would make us do it in college for soccer, and I would just be like, okay, I see that sometimes they pass the ball and sometimes they shoot. Like, what am I doing here? Like, I'm going to play the game and I'll react to what they do.
Yeah, it's interesting because football's the only one where, maybe baseball a little bit because you like to know what pitches a guy does and when they do them, but football's the only sport where it really makes sense in my head, because basketball, it's like, well, there's only got 5 guys on the court at any time. You just kind of have to know what that guy is good at. And hockey, I don't understand, and at this point, I'm too embarrassed to ask. Like, football, because football, it's kind of necessary just because football is so insistent on patterns and routines and systems that if you watch enough film, you can kind of game the system. Like, knowledge really is half the battle, especially for quarterbacks whose job, like, basically, a quarterback has to, in the 30 seconds from getting the play call to actually playing the snap, has to relay the play to everyone, get everyone lined up, look at the defense, see what the defense is doing, figure out if the play they called is going to work, and then execute whatever they decide on. There's actually a really great story, and I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but there was a very good defensive back named Ed Reed, and there was this incredible play where he picked off Peyton Manning, and Peyton, it's like, where the hell is he throwing it to? Ed Reed was right there, and Ed Reed explained, yes, I knew Peyton was going to watch a lot of film, so I deliberately did the defensive coverage wrong in the previous game. I went to the right side of the field, so he would think, oh, I'm going to have an opening in the left side of the field. So I changed direction in the game against the Colts and completely screwed up his brain.
I like that. Adapting.
Yeah. Yes. Now, football very much is a game of adapting, which is something we're going to talk about as we keep going. My second overarching point is what I call, how many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man? So this was kind of a transition year where some of the old guard quarterbacks kind of feel like they got put out to pasture. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers. So the Green Bay Packers came in kind of a Super Bowl favorite. They were kind of one of the teams that was projected to, like, really be in the hunt. They were expected to be great. And they went 8-9. They didn't even have a winning record. And honestly, from the start of the season, the vibes were horrific. Aaron Rodgers, who you might know as an annoying internet man who just makes a scene, and he's famous for doing drugs now for some reason. He does ayahuasca. He alternated between screaming at his teammates all the time, like an upsetting amount, where I'm like, God, stop. Or just physically distancing himself. Like, he would sit by himself on the bench. He would like walk around. Like, it seems, I don't even know how to describe his energy, but it just seemed like he decided the team wasn't good enough and gave up on them, like, right away. And then in the 11th hour, against all odds, they managed to get close enough that all they had to do was win one final game to get into the playoffs. And they blow it in embarrassing fashion to the Detroit Lions, a famous doormat of a team. And Aaron Rodgers is already doing, like he did last year, he's doing his whole, maybe I'll retire. I'm going to go to, he literally said, I'm going to go to, I heard there's a thing called a blackout room where you just sit in a pitch black room for a couple days. And it really feels like this is the poop or get the off the pot moment for the Green Bay Packers. Because they went through this with Brett Favre, where for like 5 straight seasons, Brett Favre was like, I don't know, maybe I'll retire. And they were like, great, we'll start working on like a succession plan. And then at the 11th hour, he goes, I'm coming back. Give me more money. And they just can't. They can't do this 2 times in a row. They have to, especially because they have a younger quarterback on the team named Jordan Love, who it's like, is he good? Is he not good? We don't know because he's not playing. And at some point, you have to figure out if he can play. Otherwise, you have to get a new quarterback.
That must be such a weird situation for specifically that new quarterback, because it's like, you're a quarterback in the NFL, and like that's like the basically best you can do, like the arguably most important position on the team, but you're also the backup, so it's like you're not super famous yet. You're just kind of like there waiting for somebody to like give up their seat.
Yeah, this is something I'm going to talk about when we talk about the playoffs, because some interesting stuff happened with backup quarterbacks. But it's especially interesting because like you really don't get to practice a lot as a backup quarterback. Usually you just stand in as a dummy for the defense to work on. Like you pretend to be the other team's quarterback. You rarely get to run snaps with the like main offensive starters. And one of my favorite quotes anyone's ever said in football is someone asked the Colts coach when Peyton Manning was around, hey, why don't you give the backup more practice time? And the guy just pointedly said, if 18 doesn't play, we're fucked. We want to practice fucked. There's no point in practicing fucked. And I'm like, I can't deny your logic there, sir. But it just, I don't know. It will come up in an interesting way. But yes, it is so fascinating, the history of backup quarterbacks, especially for this guy. They drafted him in the first round. They were like, we want to get out in front. Aaron Rodgers' career is probably almost over. Then Aaron Rodgers threw a temper tantrum, won league MVP 2 years in a row. And now Jordan Love is just sitting there kind of like, are you going to trade me? Am I allowed to be in the building? I don't know. And the other one is Tom Brady. So Tommy Boy had a whole year. We described the drama that he went through in the offseason where he retired, announced that he was coming out of retirement, and seemingly tried to change teams only for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to be like, no, you're under contract. You have to play for us. And this season was the season from hell for him. So they went 8-9. They didn't even get an even record. His wife divorced him, and because she wanted him to quit. His former friend, wide receiver Antonio Brown, had a meltdown on social media where he implied he was going to cuck him. The team was like, they were very bad. Again, it was another like series of videos where he's just like screaming at his teammates. Everyone seemed to be at each other's throats. His face just changed shape, suggesting that whatever Botox he got wasn't working anymore. Well, that feels like a personal attack. But yeah, he just seemed like completely done. And it's so interesting when you're watching, like half his offensive line got hurt, and that kind of ended up being what seemed to do him in. Because he realized, oh, this guy doesn't want to get hit anymore. He doesn't want to get tackled. So every play, instead of like trying to make the play work, if someone comes toward him, he just throws the ball away. And it's like, well, that you can't run an offense like that. You have to accept you're going to get hit sometimes. And all of this, and they ended up making the playoffs, which, and again, we'll talk more about the playoffs, but my stance is you should at least have to have more wins than losses to get into the playoffs. Like, come on. We don't let that many teams into the playoffs. Can we at least reach that standard?
That would make sense.
Yeah, it's something they've talked about for a while. But anyway, the whole thing ends. They get kind of creamed in the playoffs, and Tom announces once again he's retiring. Quote, for real this time. Here's my stance. I don't fucking believe him. I think what happened was he ran out of places he could go because he was clearly done with Tampa Bay. He was literally conspiring with the Dolphins to sign with them and become a co-owner. So once he retires, he owns the Dolphins, or at least partially owns them. I don't really understand how ownership works sometimes. And there was a lot of talk about like, oh, maybe he'll go to the New York Jets, who are actually a very good team. But unfortunately, we're saddled with their quarterback is Zach Wilson, the MILF Manor man, as I
Nice.
call him. Well, I don't call him that, but everyone makes fun of the fact that he's into MILFs, apparently. Uh, his teammates actively rebelled against him and forced the coach to bench him. So it's like, oh, Tom Brady could go there. Or maybe Tom Brady will try to go to Miami again. Or maybe he'll go to San Francisco. And all of those teams have kind of decided on other things. The Dolphins have decided they're going to commit to Tua. The 49ers are like, we'll see how this works with Brock Purdy and Trey Lance. And it just seems like everyone was like, why would we invest this much in like 1 year of Tom Brady? If someone comes up, I believe he's going to end up coming out of retirement.
Well, they'll just make another commercial with Gronk, and then he'll make his comeback.
Or he'll get into crypto again. Have you seen that crypto ad that Tom Brady's done?
Was it the one with Gronk, or was that a different one?
No, that was a different one. I only bring it up because it is very funny, because when you watch it, it's with his wife, and it is very obvious they filmed on different days.
Oh, no.
Yes, and that was like, oh, man, they really are donezo. And the third quarterback in this discussion, which leads me into my third story of the year, as I call it, Russell Wilson falls back into a ditch.
Oh, wait. Before we move on, I do have a question about... So, yes. Tom Brady got divorced.
Mm-hmm.
Because he keeps going back to play football. Does he just love football that much? Because it can't be more money, right? Like, he must be unreasonably wealthy. Like, he can't be like, man, I really got to make these payments when I retire.
Yeah, no, it's not a money thing, because he was famous for taking slightly smaller for the most part when he could have. Like, I don't remember him ever breaking the record for most money a quarterback made, even though he reasonably could have asked for that. But at the same time, he is very comfortable. He's done enough endorsements. He has enough investments.
And he's already, like, solidified himself as, like, one of the top football players of all time, right? He's probably broken some records here and there.
Oh, yes. He basically owns every single passing record at this point, partially because he played so long. Like, he's 45. That's insane. Like, there are very few quarterbacks who played to 40. Playing to 45 is unhinged. It's literally unprecedented. And that was like his big goal as he was like building his career up. He's like, I think I can play to 45. I've talked to people, I've done studies. I think if I do things right, I can easily continue to play to 45. It really is just, I think there are just certain people whose brains are wired in a way where it's like, I got to do this thing. Like, this is my identity. I have to keep doing it.
It's like that free solo climber guy.
Exactly. It kind of is that. There's really no other way to describe it. And for him, it's even more frustrating because I don't think he's ever going to be happy with an ending. Because he could have went out on top when he won a Super Bowl at Tampa Bay. He'd proven everything he needed to prove. He was one of the few quarterbacks to win a Super Bowl with two different teams. Like, it felt like, oh, this is perfect. And then the next year, they lost in the playoffs, but he played incredibly well. Like, there's no happy ending for him playing, but he has to keep playing. And I think he also just struggles with, like, I don't think he's really thought about what he wants to do after this. He has this lifestyle brand called TB12. I've never seen anyone wear the shirts or use it. So it seems like it's just kind of there. He's theoretically signed a contract where when he retires, he could join the Fox, the Fox Sports commentating. They do the NFC games. But, like, there's very little I've seen from him that suggests that he really wants to do that or if he'd be that good at it. I really just think he's dedicated his life so much to football. He mentally just hasn't made a contingency plan for when he can't do that anymore.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't like him, but I do kind of feel real bad. Like, I mean, no, I'm not going to say that. My stance is, no matter how much I hate a player, I don't want anyone to get hurt, because getting hurt's scary. I just want Antonio Brown to lose the last bit of sanity he has and say something like, oh yeah, Tom Brady does steroids, and just blow the whole thing up. I mean, look, I'm not going to accuse anyone, but I don't believe in Santa Claus, is how someone put it. Anyway, story 3, Russell Wilson falls into a ditch.
Yeah, Rumpelstiltskin. Tell me about him.
Yes, so we talked about the Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos have been the perennial, man, if they just had a great quarterback. They brought it, it had been a while since Peyton Manning had retired for them, so they'd been struggling to find a replacement quarterback. And finally, they're like, all right, new owners, new everything, we're going for broke. They traded an unhinged amount. They traded multiple one first-round pick and a bunch of other picks to get Russell Wilson, basically mortgaging their future on the idea of Russell Wilson's the final piece of this puzzle. This is going to bring everything together for us. It was an unfathomable, calamitous shit show from day one. Their first game, they kind of just ran out of time and had to rush a field goal team on and missed. They went 5-12. One of the game, and I should note, one of the games they won, Russell Wilson didn't play. There was a running meme. And here's the thing. It'd be one thing if he just played bad. But he played kind of jaw-droppingly bad in terms of, how do you go from a guy who was considered, he was, always in the conversation for the MVP to this, in the span of a year. He had been declining a little bit, but not to the extent that we saw here. He only threw 16 touchdowns, which, for reference, is tied for 19th in the league. There are 32 starting quarterback positions. His quarterback rating was 36. Quarterback rating is kind of they take all the stats in the context of the plays and try to make an accumulative number out of it. It's complicated, but, it's just an easy way to evaluate these things. Was 36. That was ranked 27th. He had never been lower than 60 before in his career. So his best was basically his work. He basically halved his previous worst. And it'd be one thing if he was just playing bad, but it's the fact that everyone came out of the woodworks to poop on him and the situation. So what has become painfully apparent is that his Seattle Seahawks teammates really, 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 really fucking hated him. So he previously played for the Seattle Seahawks. There was a very famous moment that kind of changed the course of NFL history where they had won the Super Bowl the previous year, and it looked like they were going to win it again. They were going against the Patriots, and all they had to do was score one touchdown to take the lead, and they were on the 1-yard line. So in theory, all you have to do is run the ball, and then you should probably get it. But instead, they throw the ball, and Russell Wilson gets intercepted, and it costs them the game, and basically kind of resurrects Tom Brady's career in a weird way, because Tom Brady won 3 Super Bowls, and then he had a 10-year drought where he didn't win any, and they just gave him back, and that's where he goes on to get to 7. And basically from there, the whole team kind of turned on Russell Wilson because they're like, oh, of course of course we tried to give this pretty boy, this glam rock guy, the glory, and it cost us a Super Bowl. And basically all of his Seattle Seahawks teammates have been subtweeting him this entire season, mocking him, taking digs at him. And a lot of his weird quirks kind of came to light. The guy kind of has an ego about him. Apparently he has his own posse who needed to have offices in the Broncos facilities. They had to push people out of offices to give his quarterback guru and his personal team. There's all he has his personal camera team taking photos of him all the time to try and sell him to Denver. He got
so strange.
Yeah, it turns out he's just a really weird guy, and it turns everyone for so long thought that Seattle is holding Russell Wilson back. If they just let him cook, that was where the meme "Let Russ Cook" comes from. It's amazing a meme destroyed a football franchise, but here we are. But it turns out no, the Seahawks were kind of geniuses in restraining this strange, odd little man. And I don't feel bad calling him little. He is very short. He's 5'11". We're taller than him.
Yeah. That's fair.
The Broncos actually had an incredible defense this year that was one of the top 5 in the league. And all of there were multiple incidences where defensive players were screaming at him at the top of their lungs, on camera. At one point, the backup quarterback tried to stand up for him, and one of the defenders like kind of grabbed the guy. All the while, he got hurt multiple times. There was a running meme where apparently his mansion has like 12 bathrooms. So there was a discussion of like, will he have more touchdown passes than he has bathrooms? Tune in to find out. And ultimately, it resulted in the head coach Nathaniel Hackett fired. Nathaniel Hackett, we talked about last time. It was very clear because Nathaniel Hackett was previously worked as the quarterback coach for the Packers. Apparently, Aaron Rodgers, like he was Aaron Rodgers' guy, and there was a lot of sentiment that the Broncos really wanted to trade for Aaron Rodgers. That was their original plan before the Packers are like, nah, we're going to keep him for another year. And here's the thing. If I'm the Broncos, I would absolutely come out and say, hey, we hired this coach because we thought it would get us Aaron Rodgers. Because if you thought this guy was actually a good coach, you're crazy. Like, he was somehow even worse than Russell Wilson, because it's like, okay, you don't call the plays. You're not a leader. Like, you're not one of those culture coaches, like, because the team hates you. They don't listen to you. You don't do anything for the defense. You're terrible at clock management. Like, you've had multiple times where the crowd is literally screaming how many seconds are left on the play clock because you keep getting delay of games. You have 40 seconds to snap the ball or you get a 5-yard penalty. They got a lot of those. And all of it really can be summed up with they played on Christmas Day against the Los Angeles Rams, who we've already established kind of had a bad year. They lost 51-12, I believe the final score was. It might have been the most lopsided game of the year. That's when the backup quarterback almost got in a fight with a defensive player. It was also the Nickelodeon game. Because CBS has been co-airing the games on Nickelodeon to try and like sell football to kids. Yes, it's actually kind of fun. There's a lot of dumb graphics. There was a Yeti who caused an avalanche, and there was a meme going around like, why are the commentators laughing? So many people just died.
That's pretty funny.
And the seminal moment of the whole thing was Patrick Starr's voice actor did a VTube thing where they broadcasted Patrick Starr in, and Russell Wilson throws an interception that gets returned for a touchdown, and Patrick Starr goes, "Oh, that's not what he wanted to be cooking." And it's like, there was an understanding that they were just going to keep Nathaniel Hackett through the year because it's like, look, let's not fire the coach now. It's just like there's no point. The season is what it is. They fired him the day after because once Patrick Starr, a historically recorded buffoon, is dunking on you, you just have to pull the plug. You have to call it in. Like, you're not coming back from that. So, and the thing is, they're kind of stuck. They owe him $100 million. They gave him one of the biggest contracts in quarterback history. And they, like, one of my favorite podcasts were like, really, your only way out is somehow talk him into retiring or frame him for a crime. And there's very little other ways to get around this. So this offseason, because, when you're not in the playoffs, you can kind of just do whatever to get ready for the next season. They bring in Sean Payton, who was a very successful head coach for the New Orleans Saints, basically had them in Super Bowl contention for a decade and a change. They traded a first-round pick to the Saints to get him because he was still technically under contract with the Saints. Basically, one of the big adages I have for American sports is don't let one mistake turn into an even bigger mistake. And while it's good to get Sean Payton because he is a good coach, spending even more money and even more resources to basically fix Russell Wilson, like, it's a sunk cost. The smarter thing would have just been to get like some random coach, like a respected like game manager, and kind of just ride out Russell Wilson's contract and be like, look, we're going to have to start from scratch once Russell Wilson leaves. Now it's like, he better win you a Super Bowl because otherwise this is one of the more embarrassing moves in NFL history. Like, the only way you recover from all this is if he somehow wins a Super Bowl, or at least gets you close to one, because this is like almost half a decade worth of first and second round draft picks and literally $150 million on. And because I don't want this to be entirely negative, I do have a couple positive stories from this NFL season. So the teams I really want to cite are, for starters, the Detroit Lions, who they did not make the playoffs this year. But this is the exact kind of year they were hoping to have, where it's like the vibes are clearly good, the energy's up. Calum, I believe you are now familiar with at least one Detroit Lions player.
Jamal Williams.
Yes, I love him. He is now a free agent. If I were the Bills, I would give him any amount of money to be on my team. Yes, famous anime lover, loin grinder. I hate to say it, he's perfect for Detroit. The Detroit Lions, as a franchise, kind of need someone who's a little bit crazy, especially because their coach Dan Campbell. He used to play tight end, which, as Kieran would describe, is a real grinder position. And in one of his interviews was like, "Yeah, let's bite off kneecaps. That's the kind of team I want to make." And he kind of did it. He got a team of young, crazy people who are scrappy, hungry, and are capable of some surprises. And it really does feel like next year is the springboard where it's like, no, they're actually going to compete. Like they are the Eagles of last year, where it's like, okay, they're building up an infrastructure, they're building up a culture, they're getting the vibes right. Now let's go see them do cool stuff. The New York Giants are another really positive story. Former Bills offensive coordinator Brian Daboll, sort of a play-calling whiz kid, actually turned a franchise that hadn't been to the playoffs in like 6 years into a pretty decent team, especially with a noticeable, their season really was the embodiment of like Tony Stark made this in a cave with a box of scraps, because their 4 top receivers got hurt, a bunch of offensive linemen got hurt, and yet their offense was still kind of fun and exciting. They have an interesting future ahead of them, but hopefully one that's bright. And the other team I want to bring up is the Jacksonville Jaguars. And they're a feel-good story because the year before, their fans were literally showing up to the stadium in clown makeup. That is how much contempt they had for the situation and for how bad the team is. Yes, they had a 900% increase in wins this year. They went more 800. They went from 2 wins to 9. They got into the playoffs and actually won a playoff game. And more importantly, they drafted, the year before this, they drafted Trevor Lawrence, who was the next, like after Andrew Luck, he was like this is the guy of a generation. And he's starting to live up to the hype. And I don't know, I just like when football players who have great expectations are good. Like, it's just nice to have lots of good players in the NFL. The next story I wanted to bring up is I'm starting to worry the quarterback position might be a bit overrated. And we'll talk about this during our Super Bowl hype discussion because it's the perfect embodiment of this. But more than ever, this season really underlined for me my philosophy of obviously, if you have one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the NFL, you have a chance to win. That's just because they can get really, really hot for 3 games and just be unstoppable. But the more sensible route is to build a really, really, really good team and get a B+ quarterback. So, for example, the Dolphins made the playoffs with Tua Tagovailoa playing most of their games. They invested a lot in wide receiver the last few years, and they actually had kind of a dynamic, exciting offense. Honestly, the Eagles are kind of the best example of this, because is Jalen Hurts a truly great quarterback? I'm not 100% sure. I watch him, and I know he's at least good, but is he a top 5 quarterback? And then I get to the point where I'm like, I don't really think it matters, because they just have so much talent from top to bottom, inside and out, that Jalen Hurts is good enough to elevate them to be a Super Bowl contending team. Even the Lions, it's like, okay, Jared Goff isn't the best quarterback, but everyone around him is so good and scrappy and excitable. They're pulling it off. And we'll talk about this when we get to the playoff discussion. San Francisco 49ers were on their 3rd quarterback, and they won 13 games. I think there's this really interesting, and it's another example of meta change where really smart teams are building incredible infrastructures where it almost doesn't matter. As long as the quarterback isn't actively hurting them, they're going to be in the contention. They're going to have a chance to win. And my final thing I wanted to talk about for this discussion is, unfortunately, we do have to talk about, well, it's two things. One, the rising concussions, and of course, DeMar Hamlin, because they are, unfortunately, definitive stories for this season. So,
Yeah.
in week 3 I'll start with the concussions. In week 3, the Miami Dolphins played the Buffalo Bills. Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa gets shoved, hits the ground, gets up, and then immediately stumbles and falls. It was pretty clear he had a concussion, and yet they let him go back into the game. The following week, they played the Cincinnati Bengals. He takes another hit, and truly one of the most upsetting things I've ever seen on a football field so far, unfortunately.
Nice.
And he had to be carried off in an ambulance. This forced the NFL to finally acknowledge that the concussion protocol wasn't working, and they have made major changes to try to make things, or at least acknowledge that things need to be changed. So now there is be up in a booth watching the game, and if they see one or a handful of red flags, like, oh, someone hit their head weird, or oh, someone's kind of stumbling a little bit, they have veto power to basically pull the switch and say, hey, I think this guy might have a concussion. You need to take him out and test him right now.
Haven't they seen Will Smith's movie?
Well, honestly, that's kind of what all of this is building up to, because a recent study found that 90% of NFL players who they tested had CTE, which is kind of mortifying when you think about that.
It's a lot.
What's scary is Tua kept trying to play through it. He had 2 concussions in back-to-back weeks, where it's like, a concussion can knock someone out. Like, it should knock them out for, like, at least, multiple weeks. He did back-to-back. He comes back and is actually playing well, and then he gets sort of an innocuous hit during the Packers game, and suddenly he starts playing really off. He throws, 3 straight interceptions, and then they announce after the game he's back in concussion protocol. There's actual discourse right now about, should he be playing anymore? He's had 3 major concussions in the span of, 7 weeks. That's really dangerous. And it's kind of forcing the NFL to really just reevaluate how it approaches concussions, because, and it's especially in terms of scheduling, because people have complained about Thursday night games, because let's say you play Sunday, then you have to turn around and play Thursday. That's like a 4-game turnaround. Your body simply can't recover from that much physical damage. And I think a lot of discourse, it's sort of, and we'll talk about DeMar in a minute, which ties into, but there is a growing sentiment of the players kind of need to take the steering wheel back, ensuring their safety. And then, of course, we need to talk about the other huge injury story of the year. So, a Monday Night Football game, it's January 2nd, the Buffalo Bills were playing the Cincinnati Bengals. Monday Night Football game, and actually a really important one, because basically, if the Bills won, they would be almost guaranteed the number 1 seed, and if the Bengals won, they would at least have a chance to get the number 1 seed. It was the first time Joe Burrow and Josh Allen had played each other. There was discourse that it would be the most exciting regular season game in years. A bit of the way through the first quarter, safety DeMar Hamlin makes a routine tackle, stands up, and then immediately collapses. They cut to him commercial. We assume it's a head injury or something.
And they do the Whopper, Whopper, Whopper song.
Yes, they do the Whopper, Whopper, Whopper song. They cut back, and still nothing has happened. Everyone's still waiting. Someone uses the term CPR for the first time, and immediately everyone goes, oh, this is different, and this is bad. He gets rushed to the hospital, and it eventually comes out that he had gone in cardiac arrest on the field. And they've never explicitly said it, the NFL, but there have been rumblings, and given how mortified the players on the field looked, genuinely distressed, it sounds like he was actually dead for a moment there. They had to bring him back to life. And it's, there's a lot that can be said about this in so many different ways, completely independent of both in the sense of what it means for the league, what it means for individual players. I'm not going to focus on the specific, the ramifications of the NFL, how it changed the playoff seeding. That's just kind of gross. It is a pretty unprecedented event. The NFL does not cancel games. They have canceled one game previously in like the last 30 to 40 years. Like, this is just not something they do. So for them to realize how unprecedented the situation was, plug on what was considered one of the biggest games in recent memory, was kind of huge. And it also led to a lot of discourse about how the NFL treats its players in terms of their contracts. So Damar Hamlin is not guaranteed health insurance yet because he's only a second-year player. You need to have played in the NFL for at least years to get the NFL's insurance. A lot of his guarantees and a lot of his contract numbers were at being voided because of this. And the NFL and the Bills came to an agreement to pay him. It is mortifying that it had to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, they're just going to be like, oh, that sucks too.
Yeah, no, and it is a shocking amount of players go through that because when I talk about these things and we go through big stories, these are about these are basically the titans of the league. Like when I talk about Russell Wilson, he has like 12 years of it. When I talk about Josh Allen, he's been an MVP contender for years now. Like the average NFL career is barely 2.5 years. Like 99% of players who will put on a go out there on Sundays and like really put their bodies on the line, and now literally their lives are not going to get that glory. They're not going to get millions of dollars. They'll get a couple thousand at best based on like the minimum wage in the NFL. But like there are so many little things that really do kind of screw over players. And it caused a lot of players to go back to like they were negotiating a new contract in the NFL, like the players union and the league back in 2020, and players kind of had to cave on a lot of things. They didn't want to add a 17th game, but they kind of got pressured into it. Like the league owners kind of were like, well, we want to give you all football, but these players, they're just asking for so much. And in the wake of this Damar Hamlin thing, people are fortunately and rightfully fucking pissed because like if this is just a thing that can happen on football fields, like it changes everything. And there's a growing sentiment of like the players have to take more hard lines. We have to get behind them because like it is unacceptable how little they're guaranteed, how much danger they're in. Like especially in the context of like the other side is literal billionaires who are who have spent this entire year protecting Dan Snyder, a fellow billionaire who has been accused of egregious crimes, including but not limited to fraud and covering up sexual abuse. Like, it feels like it sucks that Damar Hamlin has to become the face of things. Like, because I don't know, that's horribly stressful, and like I feel like most people are content to go through their lives being well known, but not like having to be crusaders for causes. But if one of the things that comes out of this is a greater public push for the players' union, greater public support for the players' union, and a better understanding of like a better push for taking care of these players, at least all of this wasn't for nothing. And fortunately, Damar Hamlin is continuing to make a full recovery. He is already out of the hospital. He's still obviously working through a lot of recovery stuff. He recently did a video for the Bills, and it really is heartbreaking because he, by all accounts, was one of the best guys on the Bills in terms of heart. He was very much a heart guy. He had to come in because of injuries and was playing very well. And pointedly, someone pointed out that he had a toy drive charity 2 years before he got into the NFL. This wasn't a case of him getting an agent and the agent being like, all right, what charity do you want to do? What's like your way of getting into the city? He did that on his own accord because he was just a good person.
Oh.
And like, if there's one person who I expect, I don't know, if there's one person who I think will recover from this and live a full, rich life, I do believe it's him. And if, him going out there and giving it all on the, putting it all on the line is enough to make the NFL safer for other players, then that's probably a good sacrifice. And do you have any questions coming out of this episode?
No, I think you summarized things pretty well, the ups and downs of this NFL season, and now it's all culminating into the final game.
Yes. When we come back, we will quickly go through the playoffs and then have a brief discussion setting up the Super Bowl. I guess I will give my thoughts on the playoff teams going into that.
Mhm.
And until then, podcast, 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 podcast. Have it your way.
Yeah.